These are the Himalayas, an enormous mountain range that many people know because of just one peak. Yes, there it is, Everest. People call it the most dangerous, the most terrifying mountain on Earth, but that's not really true. So let's move about 600 miles to the northwest. This is K2, and if Everest is the world's main office where you can simply buy your way in, then K2 is a private club, where the membership fee is your life. Judge for yourself. Everest has been conquered more than 11,000 times, K2 fewer than 500. While people line up in queues on Everest, there's dead silence up here. This place is a true glitch in the matrix of mountaineering. But K2 isn't scary because it's unpopular. There's another reason. On Everest, the death rate is around 3%. That's a lot, but there's still hope of reaching the summit. On K2, that number shoots up to 25%. Meaning every fourth person who dares to challenge this mountain pays for it with their life. And that's not even the worst part. On Everest, death is a tragedy that can sometimes be fixed. There are helicopters, there's logistics, and for enormous sums of money, they might try to bring a body back to the family. But on K2, it's different. If you cross the 26,250 foot mark and something goes wrong, then that's it. Right here and right now, your body becomes just another trophy claimed by the mountain. And today you'll learn exactly why K2 is the deadliest peak on Earth and why the world will ignore any tragedy that happens there. When you hear record height, your mind automatically jumps to Everest, 29,032 feet. Even people who've never cared about mountains know that number, but almost nobody thinks about second place, 28,251 feet. That's K2. And yes, that's not as high, but on a different kind of statistic, it has a reputation that makes your skin crawl. For a long time, K2 was the only peak above 26,247 feet that no one had ever summited in winter. That rule finally broke in 2021 when climbers did the impossible and realized K2 doesn't let go, even after death. In January that year, a team of Nepalese Sherpas reached the top, shattering K2's winter invincibility, and made it back down to camp. But just days after their victory, the celebration turned into tragedy. While people below celebrated, another group was moving up the same route. Among them was Ali Sadpara, a legend of Pakistani mountaineering. He vanished high on the mountain with two teammates. And the most important part of this story isn't the drama, but the mechanics. On K2, a person can simply disappear into the frozen emptiness so completely that news arrives days late, sometimes months late. No video, no witnesses, no neat narrative of a rescue team was dispatched. After that, something happened that would feel simple anywhere else. His family wanted to bring him home. Ali's son returned to K2 in a milder season. Above 26,247 feet, he found the bodies. But finding them doesn't turn into an evacuation the way movies suggest. He could do only one real thing: move his father's body closer to camp and bury him in the snow. The mountain wouldn't allow more, and there are many stories like this. Bodies remain on the mountain not because people don't want to help, but because there's usually nothing they can do. About 100 climbers have died on K2 throughout the history of ascents, and a significant number of their bodies are still on the slopes. Not as a grim symbol, but because every extra movement becomes a risk to the living. And if you think Everest works the same way, it doesn't. That mountain plays by different rules. On Everest, you can pay $70,000 to $100,000 to recover a body. Since 2019, the Nepalese army has run annual cleanup operations there, and most recently, in 2024, they brought down 5 bodies in a single effort. Yes, there are still around 200 bodies on the world's highest mountain, but the process exists, and recovery is possible. K2 is a different level of danger, and here's why. Let's take a closer look at Everest. All around it, there are camps and even settlements nearby. In other words, people, infrastructure, civilization. Now compare that to the area around K2, where it's completely empty. That's because the mountain isn't in Nepal's tourist hub. It's out in the remote backcountry of Pakistan. There's no Wi-Fi on every corner, no crowds of witnesses with cameras like you see at Everest Base Camp. Disasters on K2 happen quietly. Someone can vanish at around 26,247 feet, and people may only learn what happened days later. And the scariest part is that isolation is only the beginning. When you climb that high, you enter a place with a brutally honest name, the death zone. We're simply not built to function up there. Your body starts shutting down from lack of oxygen, and yet climbers still push for the summit. And here's how they do it. First comes a long period of acclimatization in the base camps. Then the main cheat code comes into play, supplemental oxygen, which helps you survive the oxygen deficit and reach the top. But one wrong move at that altitude and you're done. And in those conditions, a wrong move isn't rare because K2 has one especially dangerous feature. Unlike Everest, K2 is almost a perfect, brutally steep pyramid with virtually no gentle sections. If you stumble or lose your balance, there's no way to stop on the icy slope. You just get carried downward for a couple of miles. And it gets worse. With constant avalanches and rockfall, the mountain can fire them at climbers whenever it feels like it. But as horrifying as that sounds, it still isn't the worst of it, because then you reach the most terrifying, most lethal place on K2, maybe on any mountain at all, the bottleneck. There's a thing called a serac. It's a massive vertical block of ice formed when a glacier cracks. They exist on many Himalayan peaks, but K2 has what many consider the most frightening serac on Earth. A slab up to about 330 feet long hangs right above the only viable, safe route climbers must take to reach the summit. But if it's just hanging there, what's the danger? History has an answer. August 2008. On that day, several teams were all trying to reach the summit at once. As people were turning around and funneling through the narrowest section beneath the serac, right above the bottleneck, disaster struck. A massive slab of ice suddenly collapsed. It didn't just bury the route, it literally sliced through the fixed ropes the climbers had set for the descent. In a single moment, the mountain split into before and after. Some were killed instantly by the icefall. The others were left in a deadly trap at roughly 26,900 feet. Without ropes, descending a steep, glazed slope in the death zone is almost impossible. In the end, 11 people died. Some were swept away by the ice, some fell while trying to climb down in darkness without protection, and some simply froze, left forever above the bottleneck. And yes, that route is still dangerous. Only part of the hanging mass came down, and the place remains a kind of Russian roulette. If you make it through, it's not because you did everything right, it's because you got lucky. And even if you pass the bottleneck, what comes next? Well, first you still have to get there. K2 has a couple more truly terrifying surprises in store. At around 22,000 feet, climbers hit House's Chimney, a near vertical wall with a tight crack you have to climb to move higher. And at that point, pretty much everything becomes uncomfortable. Squeezing up that fissure would be hard even without gear, but climbers are typically hauling heavy loads on their backs. After that comes the so-called Black Pyramid, a nasty mix of rock and ice that also has a habit of shedding pieces. And as if all of that weren't enough, nature steps in and makes things worse. Literally. That's when K2 starts playing by its own completely unfair rules. Of all the 26,247-foot peaks, this mountain has the most unpredictable climate. On Everest, climbers can usually wait for somewhat foreseeable weather windows, but on K2, a storm can hit in minutes, without warning. That's because the mountain stands apart, and its summit seems to tear clouds into shreds, creating its own weather traps. Winds over 125 miles per hour aren't rare here, they're almost expected. And this isn't wind that merely slows you down, it knocks you off your feet, burns exposed skin, and can rip a tent along with people right off the slope and fling it away. On K2, weather isn't background noise, it's an active enemy. But wait, aren't there camps where you can sit it out? In theory, yes. In practice, it often doesn't work. In 1986, a team reached Camp 4, the last camp before the summit. They planned to acclimatize there and then go for the final push. And then, in a single moment, K2's weather reminded everyone who was in charge. A brutal storm hit and didn't let up for 4 full days. And during that time, the team ran out of food and out of fuel for melting snow, meaning they ran out of water too. When the storm finally cleared, one person was dead and the others were exhausted. No water, no oxygen, no food, no strength left at all. Now to the big question. In conditions like that, is it even possible to bring bodies down from K2? Up there, just saving the living, people who are constantly teetering between life and death on the ascent, is already a miracle. For a long time, the answer seemed obvious. No, it's not realistic. But once it was done, though it wasn't easy in the slightest. In August 2024, a Pakistani team of climbers managed to lower the body of a man who had died on K2 slope. And not just anywhere, on the most dangerous section, the bottleneck, at around 26,900 feet. This was not a small, spontaneous effort. It was a full-scale operation. It involved Pakistan's most experienced climbers, and they prepared for a long time. waiting for an incredibly rare window when the weather on that mountain would be even briefly tolerable. They planned every move, every minute, every foot of the route. In the end, everything aligned. Months of preparation, unbelievable luck, and fierce motivation to recover the body at any cost. It's only been done once, and that's why everyone else who's died on K2 will remain there forever. But let's imagine for a moment that conditions on K2 somehow improved. Would it be possible to bring everyone down then? Sadly, even with better weather, recovery would still take staggering effort and an enormous amount of money. Here's why. An average person might weigh about 176 pounds. But at that altitude, a body freezes solid, becomes fused to the slope, and turns into an ice-locked mass weighing closer to 330 pounds. You don't lift it, you have to chop it out with axes made of ice. That alone can take up to 11 hours, and that's if the body isn't in the death zone, because up there, things turn into a real nightmare. Above 26,247 feet, a person's strength basically drops to zero. Even for Sherpas, who people often call superhuman. Up there, they can carry no more than about 55 pounds, roughly a third of what they can haul lower down. Now some simple math. To move a single body weighing around 330 pounds, you need a team of at least 8 to 12 people. And then comes the descent, which is a whole separate problem. The thing is, you can't just carry a body. It's wrapped in a bag, strapped to plastic sleds, and literally dragged down over icy ridgelines. To pull it just about 2.2 miles to the nearest camp takes roughly 24 straight hours of work, with no time for sleep, no room for mistakes. In short, recovering dead climbers is a problem in itself, but K2 multiplies the difficulty by an order of magnitude. And the strangest part is that people now seem to be losing their fear of this mountain. If K2 used to see only a handful of climbers each season, just a few people, today everything is changing. In recent years, large expeditions have been showing up more and more often, sometimes several teams at once. In good seasons, dozens reach the summit, and more permits are issued than ever before. And no, the mountain hasn't gotten any gentler, people are just preparing differently. Forecasting is more accurate now, gear is more reliable, and the experience of Sherpas and high-altitude guides is enormous. What once seemed almost impossible now looks like an extreme but still manageable risk. Not for everyone, but for well-prepared teams. And then there's psychology. When one team breaks trail, others follow. When K2 was climbed in winter, the last aura of totally unreachable vanished. The mountain was no longer forbidden. And when it's no longer forbidden, it starts attracting crowds, which brings another problem. Because more people on K2 doesn't just mean more bodies that'll never be recovered, it also means turning an untouchable mountain into a mountain of trash. Expeditions haul up everything you need to stay alive on a 26,247-foot peak. Tents, fuel, oxygen bottles, ropes, carabiners, batteries, and that's nowhere near the full list. On the way up, every item is essential. On the way down, it turns into dead weight. Then there's emergency trash, gear left behind after accidents. When someone freezes, falls, or simply can't go on, whatever they had with them often remains. A backpack, a jacket, gloves, oxygen, sometimes an entire camp. In moments like that, nobody's cleaning up. The mountain becomes a graveyard not only for people, but for their things. But wait, if it's always snowing, everything is ice, and there are constant collapses, the trash is supposed to stay buried. How does it ever become visible? For a long time, snow and ice did hide it all. But glaciers move, snow melts, and old camps resurface like time capsules. Tents from the 90s, ropes from the 80s, unmarked oxygen bottles, suddenly it's all back on the surface again. And that created a strange situation. While the ice kept everything covered, Pakistan considered the mountain clean. Once the debris started reappearing, the country saw the scale of the problem and immediately began organizing cleanups. For example, in 2022, the authorities cleaned K2 together with Pakistani climbers and porters, removing roughly 1.5 tons of trash in total. But that's not even the most interesting part. The cleanup covered the stretch from K2 base camp all the way up to Camp 4 at about 25,600 feet, which raises the obvious question, how do you remove garbage from a place no helicopter can reach? They did it by hand, step by step, moving loads down through the camps, almost like another Pakistani special operation on K2, except this time it was about hauling trash. And the truth is, K2 is being cleaned up constantly. In 2023, private teams did the same thing alongside regular expeditions. They collected discarded waste and sent it down the mountain. Reportedly, they managed to gather around 1,100 pounds of trash that way. And in 2024, the Climb to Change project appeared, where climbers built trash collection into their ascent plans, picking up debris along the route and carrying it down. In total, they collected about 1.7 tons across Pakistan's mountains. Even so, the future looks grim. More people are coming to the mountain, and the amount of trash will keep rising. Yes, K2's brutal conditions might slow the buildup, but let's look at what happened to Everest. Experts estimate that in just one stretch near the South Col at roughly 26,247 feet, there may still be 40 to 50 tons of trash left on the mountain that hasn't been removed yet. And that's despite Nepal working very actively to clear Everest of debris. In 2022, the world was stunned by reports that in a single year, people brought down about 34 tons of abandoned tents, canisters, and other junk. Nepal also ran a major cleanup in 2019. That year, they hauled 3 tons of trash off Everest. And in other years, Nepali teams have kept doing similar operations. But simply collecting garbage after climbers while the number of tourists grows every year feels inefficient, you might say? Maybe there's a more effective strategy? Well, there was one. In 2014, Nepal introduced a system. Every climber paid a deposit of about $4,000. Want your money back? Bring down at least 18 pounds of trash. It didn't even have to be yours. You could collect waste from older expeditions. On paper, it looked perfect. Ecology, responsibility, a compromise with the brutal reality of extreme altitude. It seemed like it should finally work, but it didn't. Climbers did exactly what the rule required. Trash was brought down, but almost always from base camp and the lower camps, where it's safer and easier and doesn't put your life on the line. Up high, 23,000 to 26,247 feet, almost nothing changed. And honestly, it's easy to see why. At that altitude, every extra pound is a risk. Hauling an old tent from Camp 4 or dragging an oxygen bottle off the South Col costs strength, time, and sometimes your last reserves of energy. In that situation, $4,000 stops being a real incentive. Your life is worth more. But the problem ran deeper than that. Nepal also didn't do the math. A standard expedition generates more than 22 to 26 pounds of waste per climber. So even if everyone followed the rules perfectly, some trash would still remain on the mountain. The deposit system didn't reduce the total volume. It mostly created the illusion that everything was under control. In 2025, that was officially acknowledged. The refundable deposit scheme was canceled. Not because the idea was stupid, but because over 10 years it never produced meaningful results where they mattered most. So what can you realistically do about Everest's trash problem? In 2025, Nepal finally did what Everest had needed for years. It launched a real long-term cleanup plan. 5 years running through 2029. The important part isn't the nice timeline. Before, it was basically season ends, clean up, forget. Then the next season came and the mountain filled up again. Now the logic is different. Cleanup stops being a one-off campaign and becomes a state responsibility. One key part of the plan is the mountain rangers, not volunteers, not Sherpas doing it in between climbs, but dedicated staff working on the route on a constant basis. But still, cleaning Everest remains brutally difficult, even in an age of drones and unmanned tech. So why not adapt these machines for something genuinely useful? Nepal did exactly that. In 2025, drones were used, not for flashy footage, but for real work. They started flying trash out from camps below base camp. Hundreds of pounds of old tents, canisters, and packaging were moved down without putting people at risk. It's still experimental, but it works. In one season, these drones removed about 620 to 660 pounds of trash from around 19,700 feet. And they did it faster and far more safely than a human could. What about K2? In theory, the same approach could be used there, but whether it'll actually happen is still an open question. Few people are eager to haul trash off a mountain where the odds of getting trapped are terrifyingly high.